Welcome to Unit 4 on Social Amplification of Risk. This is the final part of the 3 units that focus on the behavioural sciences area of risk analysis. The 3 parts are risk perception, risk communication, and the social amplification of risk. Our agenda is as follows: defining social amplification of risk, outlining the social amplification of risk framework, SARF for short, case study examples of BSc in the UK. Finally, a few words on preparing your SARF virtual poster board assignment. Kasperson and Kasperson define social amplification of risk as the phenomena by which information processes, institutional structures, social group behaviour, and individual responses shape the social experience of risk, thereby contributing to risk consequences. There are 4 key parts to SARF. First, the risk event characteristics such as the degree of dread and familiarity, known and unknown, of the risk. You can refer back to the risk perception matrix in Unit 2 for details on these. Second, amplification attenuation stations that amplify or reduce the perceived risk, e.g. risk communication. Third, the ripple effects, both actual and or potential effects. And fourth, impacts, again actual and or potential. Let's look at each of these 4 areas in more detail. This slide displays the SARF. According to Kasperson and Kasperson, the social amplification of risk framework recognizes how social institutions and structures process a risk to shape its effect upon society and the responses of management institutions and people. Brooke Rogers mentions that the framework persists that the public's perceptions and ripple effects can be amplified by institutions failing to take the social context of risk into account when making decisions and conveying information to the public. Starting with risk and risk events on the left, social amplification or attenuation can begin with a risk event. The risk event could be a terrorist attack, fracking, genetically modified food for example. This is where the degree of dread and known unknown comes into it. Second, risk amplification or attenuation or reduction. The perceived risk can be amplified or attenuated through nodes that include risk communicators, encompassing the government, traditional and social media, social institutions and organisations, and the effectiveness of, say, the public health institutions to a pandemic flu, for example. Factors such as personal experiences, opinion leaders' actions, social group membership and behaviours, and pre-existing trust in institutions can also increase or reduce perceived risk. These elements collectively frame how a risk is ultimately perceived, increase or reduce the dread and unknown elements. Third are the ripple effects, how the public may change their behaviours in response to the risk, such as altering travel routines, where they decide to work and live, and purchasing habits in order to reduce or avoid exposures to a perceived risk. Second and third order ripple effects may also occur beyond directly affected. Third is impacts, the consequences of the perceived risk and behaviour changes such as financial losses, loss of confidence in government institutions, litigations and casualties. An example of SARF practice is the 2001 anthrax attacks in the US. During the 2001 anthrax attacks, it could be argued that the ineffective risk communication employed by public health professionals and the federal government exacerbated the adverse reactions by the public. This included putting pressure on essential supplies of ciprofloxacin by those who unnecessarily took the antibiotic drug, an estimated 20% of whom experienced the drug's side effects, and possibly risked changing the bacteriological environment from the widespread use of the antibiotics, rendering some organisms resistant to the antibiotics employed. The development of risk communication messages was hindered by the limited availability of epidemiological evidence and knowledge regarding the treatment and transmission of anthrax in urban environments and secondary aerolization. Published data about secondary aerolization of anthrax spores indoors was not available in late 2001. Despite these data gaps, the mixed messages, both verbal and actions, undertaken by public health officials, politicians and the media exacerbated these problems. CDC discovered that postal workers at contaminated sorting facilities interpreted the decision to prescribe them the less expensive doxycycline rather than the ciprofloxacin as a cost-saving measure. It was not made clear that doxycycline had a greater efficacy against the strain of anthrax instead of ciprofloxacin that had been given to news organizations and congressional workers in the early stages of the anthrax attacks. So what criticisms do you think could be levelled at SARF? Some are that it tries to overly simplify how risks are perceived by the public, treats the amplification and attenuation stations as having equal effects, and there are no feedback loops. These are valid, but this is a framework to help frame discussion and guide decision making to ask those questions before, during, or after a risk event to better respond and elicit desired behaviours from the public. This slide shows a more complex way of looking at SARF, created by Bill Burns at the University of Southern California, as a precursor to developing an agent-based model. Here is a flow diagram that looks at features like how public responses, pre-existing understanding of the risk, and responses can amplify or reduce perceived risk and behaviours. I don't expect you to fully delve into this, but this slide illustrates that more complex thinking to SARF is underway. Let's look at the UK's handling of the bovine spongiform epilepsy BSC in British cattle during the late 1980s and 1990s. This is a good example of risk amplification through government and industry mishandling. Humans consuming beef from BSC-infected cows were at risk of contracting Korsakoff disease, or CJD, a fatal brain disease. But little was known about the extent of BSC-infected cows in the food chain, or the chance it could lead to CJD in humans. BSC was dubbed by the British media as mad cow disease. The risk event was BSC-infected cows. Initially, the risk was downplayed by the government and supermarkets. The British government from the mid-1980s through to the 1990s sought to reassure the public about the safety of British beef by maintaining a no-risk message that beef was perfectly safe. Here we have a picture of then Agriculture Minister John Gummer taken in May 1990, eating a beef with a burger with a daughter at a farm show to convince the public eating beef was safe. But the government underestimated the public's ability to deal with risk, creating an information vacuum. Looking at the risk amplification attenuation stations, BSC risk messages from industry and government never included timely references to the latest scientific developments, and they consistently failed to acknowledge both the content and context of the evolving public concerns about BSC risks. Consequently, despite continued reassurances, the public lost trust in the government and the food industry, leading to a dramatic drop in beef consumption. For the ripple effects, changes in eating behaviour in this instance, we see that by 1995 beef consumption dropped by 20%, the equivalent of 1.4 million households no longer buying beef, and thousands of schools taking beef off the menu. Come January 1996, leading supermarkets and beef industry launched adverts in papers saying, "All is safe." But these ripple effects were accentuated when in March 1996 it was announced research showed a tentative link between BSC and CJD. This spectacular news event contained all the sensational aspects of a risk story: uncertainty, dread and catastrophe, and possible involvement of children. The announcement was made in a climate of extreme distrust of the Ministry of Agriculture and Food and Fisheries, or MAF. In August 1996, a television programme called World in Action revealed that the first known British person to have died from CJD. The impacts included significant financial losses for the beef industry, accentuated by the European Union banning the import of British beef. Litigation and the Ministry of Agriculture and Food and Fisheries was significantly structured and practices revised in dealing with risks. So what went wrong? A risk information vacuum arose where, over a long period of time, Those who were conducting the evolving scientific research and assessments for high-profile risks may note special effort to communicate the results regularly and effectively to the public. This ultimately led to a loss of public trust in the government and the British beef industry. Now we come to preparing your group staff on the virtual poster board. As the assignment states, there are 4 key questions you need to address for your assigned case study. First, what are the event characteristics, dread known and unknown risk? Second, what are the key amplification and attenuation events? Third, what are the key actual or likely ripple effects? Finally, what are the likely impacts? Here is the staff template that you will see in your group's poster board. Follow the assignment instructions on Blackboard and populate your board with a combination of text, images, videos, website links and articles. Feel free to be creative. Well, that wraps up Unit 4. Thank you for your time.